What would you do if the key to your family's redemption was hidden in plain sight, dismissed as the foolish purchase of a grieving young woman? With her last coins, Clara Reed Harcourt bought a dusty, forgotten bookshop on a narrow Edinburgh close that everyone else called a tomb. They said it was a grave for her money, the final foolish gesture of a life already shadowed by her father's ruin. Yet somewhere among those neglected shelves, a secret had been waiting quietly in the ordinary weight of paper, leather, and ink. It was an inheritance no solicitor had named, something hidden in plain sight that could restore a family's honor and a city's hope. Clara had bought only a place to stand, but the old shop was holding a truth that would change everything she thought she had lost. Settle in and let us know in the comments where you are watching from tonight. This is the story of Clara Reed Harcourt and the inheritance she found not in a will, but in the quiet, patient weight of paper and ink. The autumn of 1894 arrived in Edinburgh on a tide of damp, grey mist that clung to the stone tenements and swallowed the cries of gulls over the Firth of Forth. It was to this city of shadows and whispers that Clara Reed Harcourt returned, not in triumph but in a quiet and profound defeat. At 22, she still had the fine features that had once been praised for their intelligence, but grief had drawn the colour from her face. Her grey-green eyes held the deep stillness of a sorrow too new to have settled. She stepped down from the coach at the Grassmarket in a worn wool dress and mended boots, a plain figure among fashionable ladies climbing into carriages. In one hand she carried a small leather reticule containing the whole of her remaining money, a few sovereigns, some smaller coins, and the heavy invisible burden of her father's ruin. He had been a man of letters and quiet integrity, a respected broker whose faith in the promises of Edinburgh's merchant banks had once seemed absolute. The city around her seemed determined to continue as though nothing had happened. Porters shouted beneath dripping awnings, cartwheels struck sparks from wet stone, clerks hurried under black umbrellas, merchants disappeared into doorways where brass plates announced firms that still possessed credit, reputation, and certainty. Clara felt the contrast acutely. Only months earlier she had moved through such streets as the daughter of a respectable man. Now the same streets received her as someone whose name had become a cautionary story. She tightened her fingers around the reticule and kept walking. Clara remembered the progression of his despair as clearly as if it had been written into the walls of their old home. First came the strained silence at the dinner table. Then came the long nights over ledgers beneath a single candle, his pen scratching with frantic energy. Finally, the correspondence from Vale and Sons stopped arriving, and a chilling quiet settled over rooms that had once felt secure. His business, built on handshakes and good faith, seemed to evaporate in a matter of weeks. "They broke their word, Clara," he had whispered during his final illness, his eyes fixed on some distant point of betrayal she could not see. "They simply broke their word." His ruin, he insisted, was not the result of reckless judgment, but of a promise turned to smoke. He withered like a great oak poisoned at the root, and when he died he left Clara with almost nothing except a family name spoken with pity and the unanswered meaning of those last words. She had one destination. Tucked in a narrow winding close off the Royal Mile stood a derelict property her father had once pointed out during a happier walk. "Old Carstairs Bookshop," he had said with a sad smile. A man who loved books more than bread, the shop had been shuttered since the bookseller's death, and had remained unsold for years, an immovable fixture of decay. Its windows were so coated in grime that daylight barely entered. To most of Edinburgh the place was an eyesore. To Clara it was the only piece of ground she could afford to stand on. She had used nearly all her remaining money to purchase the deed, a decision greeted with bewildered pity by the solicitor's clerk. Now she stood before the door with the cold iron key in her palm, looking at a faded sign whose paint had almost vanished. This was her inheritance, a tomb of paper, a monument of dust. The damp cold seeped through her thin coat. Yet Clara felt not hope exactly, but something harder and more useful. She would not wither as her father had. She would stand somewhere of her own. The key grated in the lock with the sound of rust and long disuse. She pressed her shoulder against the heavy oak door, and it opened with a deep groan that seemed to release decades of trapped air. The shop smelled of old paper, leather, damp timber, and undisturbed stillness. Dust motes, thick as snowfall, floated through a narrow shaft of afternoon light. Books were everywhere, on shelves, in crates, across counters, and in teetering stacks that rose from the floor like petrified trees. It was less a shop than the site of a literary avalanche frozen in time. The scale of the neglect was almost physical, a manifestation of hopelessness that threatened to press the breath from her lungs. The front counter had vanished beneath ledgers, catalogues, broken spectacles, dry ink bottles, and curled scraps of wrapping paper. Along one wall, a rolling ladder leaned at an angle against shelves, so tall they disappeared into shadow. The floorboards bowed in places beneath the weight of books, and a slow drip somewhere toward the rear marked the seconds with maddening regularity. Yet beneath the ruin, Clara noticed craftsmanship: dovetailed drawers, hand-planed shelves, brass shelf rails darkened by age, and a carved walnut rail along the counter. The shop had once been built to last. That mattered to her. A familiar voice broke the silence. Mr. MacLeod, a kindly carter who had known Clara's family for years, stood behind her holding the battered trunk that contained all she owned. He was one of the few people from her old life who had not looked at her with pity. He peered into the dark shop and set the trunk just inside the door. "Good heavens, child, it is worse than I imagined. Are you certain about this?" "It is all I have, Mr. MacLeod," Clara replied. Her voice sounded thin in the enormous stillness. He nodded, understanding the finality of her answer, and handed her a parcel wrapped in brown paper. His wife had sent bread and cheese. "You must eat," he said. Then, with one hand still resting on the door, he added that if she needed anything at all, she was to send word. When he left, Clara was truly alone with her purchase. She spent the remainder of the day not cleaning, but walking the narrow paths between towers of books and touching their spines. At the back she found a cramped room with a rickety table and chair, likely the place where old Mr. Carstairs had spent his days. The sheer volume of knowledge was dizzying. Each book held a life, an argument, a memory, or a promise. Yet the shop still seemed determined to reject her, and every sovereign she had spent suddenly felt very real. Dusk consumed the last pale light, while Clara sat on her trunk with the untouched loaf in her lap. Had she buried herself alive? Was this only a grave for her last shillings, or did the old shop still hold some purpose? The building settled around her with creaks and groans, and somewhere in those sounds she felt the first stirring of a strange thought. The shop was beginning to speak. The following morning, Clara bought a broom with one of her few remaining coins and began to work. The simple, repetitive motion steadied her mind. As she swept the front floorboards, life stirred outside in the close. Faces appeared beyond the grimy windows. Children pointed. Women on their way to market paused to whisper. The story of the grieving broker's daughter who had bought Carstairs' Folly had already spread. She opened the shutters one by one, forcing warped hinges until grey light entered the room. She stacked salvageable books away from damp patches and carried ruined paper to the rear yard. By noon her hair had escaped its pins, soot marked one cheek, and her hands were black with dust. The work was humiliating only if she viewed it through other people's eyes. Through her own, every cleared board and every rescued shelf was proof that the shop could be made habitable. Around midday a shadow crossed the doorway. Lady Eleanor Vale stood there, tall, impeccably dressed, and perfectly composed, her black gloves and severe dark gown untouched by the dust inside the shop. She was the daughter of the man who had founded Vale and Sons and now controlled the banking house herself. Her expression carried the calm certainty of someone accustomed to deference. "Miss Harcourt," she said, looking past Clara into the chaos, "I heard a rumour, but I confess I did not believe it. Her cool gaze moved over the fallen stacks and dark shelves. A young woman playing shopkeeper in a crypt, brave perhaps, but profoundly misguided. Clara tightened both hands around the broom handle and said nothing. Lady Eleanor's father, she continued, had done business with Clara's father. His downfall had been regrettable, but it was also a lesson in judgment. The words were delivered with such polished condescension that they were more cutting than a shout. Lady Eleanor predicted that within a week Clara would be begging someone to take the ruin off her hands. Then she turned and left, carrying the sharp chill of her certainty back into the street. Late that afternoon another visitor appeared. Mr. Abernathy was old and stooped, with a kind, weary face and hands permanently stained by the ghost of printer's ink. He had worked nearby for half a century and had known Mr. Carstairs well. Unlike Lady Eleanor, he looked at the crowded shop with reverence rather than contempt. "He was a good man, old Carstairs," Mr. Abernathy murmured. "Not a businessman. Never was." His eyes moved slowly over the shelves as if measuring something Clara could not see. Then he offered a single cryptic thought. Carstairs, he said, had never cared for money. He cared for what was bound. With that, the old printer bowed and left her standing in dust and confusion. What was bound? The phrase followed Clara all evening. Did he simply mean the bindings of the books, or something more? Lady Eleanor's scorn still stung, and the whispers of the close pressed against the windows, yet Mr. Abernathy's words had awakened curiosity where despair had been. For the first time since her father's death, a question pulled her forward instead of grief holding her back. Clara could not afford separate lodging, so that night she carried her trunk up the narrow staircase at the back of the shop. The room above was colder and damper than the floor below. It held a small fireplace choked with soot, a narrow bed frame with a ruined mattress, and a single window that looked onto blackened stone. It was poor shelter, but it was hers. The one piece of furniture she had insisted on keeping from her old home was her father's wingback chair. Getting it up the staircase was an awkward struggle, the arms scraping against the plaster, but when it finally stood beside the cold hearth, it became an anchor of familiarity. Clara slept wrapped in her travelling cloak on the bare bed frame while the building spoke around her. Old timber groaning, wind whispering through the sash, and the distant mournful note of a ship's horn from Leith. The sounds did not frighten her. The bookshop began to feel less like a tomb and more like a sleeping creature. Its breath was the slow settlement of dust. Its dreams were the millions of words held in darkness below. Clara felt watched over, not by a ghost, but by the collective weight of stories that had survived longer than many of the people who wrote them. The next morning she descended the stairs not as a proprietor inspecting a failed investment, but as an inhabitant. Through the one clean patch she had wiped on the front window, pale northern light entered like a blessing. It illuminated the columns of books as though they were pillars in a forgotten cathedral. Clara ran her fingers over calfskin spines, raised bands, and brittle traces of gold leaf. A tactile understanding began to replace simple ownership. This was not merely a place of business. It was becoming a sanctuary, and she its keeper. Deeper in the shop, two green eyes blinked from behind a stack of theological folios. A thin ginger cat stared at her from the shadows, poised to flee. He was as much a forgotten relic as the books around him. Clara did not reach for him. Instead, she backed away, poured a little milk into a chipped saucer, and left it on the floor before returning to her work. An hour later, the saucer was empty. The cat remained cautious, but he watched her with growing interest. Clara called him Ink. By evening, he had allowed himself to sit within a few feet of the counter, and the small fact of another living creature in the room changed the character of the silence. The day ended not with despair, but with the companionship of a stray cat and the first real feeling that she might have come home. Days became a week. Mornings were for cleaning, letting in more light, and waging a patient war against the accumulated grime of decades. Afternoons were for sorting. Clara began imposing order on the chaos. creating sections for history, poetry, science, theology, law, and travel. She learned the different weights and textures of the books almost by touch. It was during this work that she first encountered the anomaly. She lifted a heavy commentary on Scottish property law and immediately sensed that something was wrong. The volume was heavier than its size suggested and strangely rigid. She carried it to the counter, opened it carefully, and fanned the yellowed pages. One page near the middle refused to move like the others. It was stiff, unnaturally smooth, and noticeably thicker. Holding it toward the candlelight, Clara could make out a faint rectangular shadow inside the paper itself. It looked as though two pages had been fused together with something trapped between them. Her first explanation was practical, perhaps a binder's error or damp that had welded two leaves long ago, yet the construction felt too deliberate. Mr. Abernathy's words returned to her. He cared for what was bound. Clara set the law book apart from the others. Later, while sorting a slim book of romantic poetry, she found a second stiff page. This time the hidden shape was smaller. She placed the two volumes together on the counter but did not try to open them. The discovery felt too fragile, almost like a trespass. Ink jumped onto the desk, curled beside the law book, and began to purr as if guarding it. Clara sat in her father's chair that night, looking down at the two books below. Curiosity had taken the place where despair had lived only days earlier. The shop was speaking, and she was beginning to learn its language. The pile of anomalous books grew. Clara developed a second sense for the subtle rigidity that betrayed a hidden page. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and stained with dust and ink. She learned the dry crackle of an old Bible, the smooth leather of a philosophical treatise, and the peculiar resistance of a page that contained more than words. She began recording each unusual volume in a small notebook of her own, not by copying titles that a passerby might recognize, but by noting shelf position, binding color, approximate age, and the location of the stiff leaf. A pattern slowly emerged. The books were scattered through the shop so widely that no casual search would have found them together. Carstairs had hidden them in plain sight by making them look ordinary. The method was patient, almost humble, and Clara found herself admiring the mind behind it. By the end of the second week, 17 volumes stood apart from the rest. They differed in subject, age, and value: botany, law, travel, poetry, theology, navigation, and more. Their only shared feature was the same concealed stiffness. Ink slept among them, a patch of warm ginger against the grey-brown bindings, while Clara tried to understand what sort of system Carstairs had created. One afternoon, the smell of crumbling leather brought back a memory of her father before his ruin. He had once taught her how to rebind a damaged book, showing her how to sew signatures and work glue carefully into the spine. "Respect the material, Clara," he had told her. "Paper has a memory. You listen to it." In the quiet shop, the remembered lesson felt less like sentiment than instruction. Another search produced a clue. High on a shelf beneath a shroud of cobwebs lay a small locked folio bound in dark leather. A tarnished brass clasp held it shut, and a single name, Carstairs, was embossed on the cover. There was no key. The lock resisted her attempts to open it, so Clara placed the folio beside the 17 unusual books. The mystery had moved beyond coincidence. Later that evening, she sat on the floor with ink purring in her lap and looked at the collection. 17 books, one locked journal, and a question that now felt impossible to ignore. The shop was a puzzle box. The only way forward was to open one of its secrets. At dusk the following day, Clara chose the heavy law volume. The door was bolted, and a single candle burned on the counter. From her father's bookbinding tools, she selected a thin, flexible palette knife, its blade worn smooth from use. She slid the tip carefully into the almost invisible seam at the top of the fused page and let the tool do the work rather than forcing it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the old adhesive released with a faint, dry whisper. Clara worked slowly down the edge until the two leaves parted. Inside was a hidden cavity, and pressed perfectly flat within it lay a bearer bond issued by the Royal Bank of Scotland for £500. Clara stared until her eyes blurred. £500 was more money than she had seen at one time in her life. The bond was not a fantasy. The paper was crisp, the seal official, the printing unmistakable. With trembling hands, she opened the second book. It held another bond of smaller value, and folded beside it a thin handwritten letter. The letterhead belonged to Vale and Sons, the very banking house connected to her father's ruin. It was addressed to Mr. A. Carstairs and dated from the market panic that had destroyed so many fortunes. The writer was Lady Eleanor's late father, founder of the firm. The message explained that several important client accounts had been moved beyond the reach of the panic and entrusted to Carstairs' discretion. The funds were to be held off ledger until confidence returned. The phrasing was careful, almost elegant, the sort of language respectable men used when they wished to make an extraordinary act sound temporary and prudent. The letter spoke of stability, confidence, discretion, and protection. What it did not speak of was consent. None of the clients had been asked whether their money might disappear from the books. None had been warned that they would be permitted to believe themselves ruined for the sake of preserving the institution that held their trust. Clara read the passage twice before she could continue. The most terrible sentence was also the simplest. The owners were to believe their money had been lost. It was, the banker claimed, necessary to prevent a run. The letter promised that everyone would be made whole when the danger passed. Then Clara saw the list of names: Murray, Sinclair, McGregor, and finally Harcourt, her father's name. The truth landed with the force of a blow. Vale and Sons had not merely been victims of the collapse. The founder had secretly removed selected clients' capital and hidden it through Carstairs. Those clients had been allowed to believe they were ruined, while the bank protected itself. Clara's father had died believing the money was gone and the promises broken. Carstairs, however, had preserved the money and the evidence in the only form he trusted completely: books. He had built a secret paper bank inside his own shelves. Clara sank onto a stool with the letter in her hand. The shop was not a tomb, it was an ark. A fierce autumn gale descended on Edinburgh that night. Rain streamed down the stone of the close, and wind shook the window frames while Clara worked by candlelight. She opened every one of the 17 volumes. Each yielded its treasure: bearer bonds, financial instruments, and letters. The total was staggering, enough not merely to restore her father's name, but to return fortunes to several families. Some books held a single bond. Others contained several folded instruments separated by tissue-thin sheets. In one volume, a narrow strip of paper recorded a payment date that had never been honored. In another, a brief memorandum named a widow whose house had later been sold for debt. Clara spread the evidence across the counter by family and understood that she was looking at years of private suffering reduced to neat financial marks. The discovery ceased to feel like treasure. It became testimony. A violent pounding struck the front door. Lady Eleanor Vale's voice carried through the storm, sharp and imperious. She had come, she said, to make Clara an offer for the shop, more than it was worth, enough to rescue Clara from the foolish venture before she ruined herself as her father had. Her gloved hand rattled the handle, testing the door. Clara's first reaction was fear. Had Lady Eleanor learned what lay inside the books, or was this simply the instinct of a powerful woman trying to take control of something she did not understand? Clara stood with one hand on the drawer where she had hidden the bonds and letters, unwilling to answer. Then another sound rose above the wind, a woman's cry and the thin wail of a baby. Through a clear patch in the window, Clara saw a young couple huddled with an infant in the alcove beside the doorway, trying to shelter from the rain. Their faces were hollow with exhaustion. In that moment, Clara understood what the documents meant. This was not primarily about her fortune or her revenge. It was about the names on those letters. She unlocked the door, ignored Lady Eleanor's fury, and invited the young family inside. They introduced themselves as the Murrays. They had been turned out of their rooms that morning after losing everything connected to Vale and Sons. The name struck Clara at once. Murray was one of the names on Carstairs' list. Clara did not show them the bond. Not yet. Instead, she led them to the back room, stirred the embers in the hearth, boiled water, and shared the last of her bread and cheese. She wrapped the baby in her own cloak. That night she was not an heiress to a hidden fortune. She was simply a caretaker placing immediate human need before discovery. The young father tried twice to apologize for taking her food, and twice Clara stopped him. The mother barely spoke, exhausted from carrying the child through the rain. Clara found an old blanket beneath the stairs, shook the dust from it, and made a pallet near the hearth. The scene was painfully ordinary. Wet boots by the door, steam rising from a kettle, a baby breathing against borrowed wool. Yet for Clara, it revealed more clearly than any legal paper what the hidden money represented. Behind every account number had been a household capable of being broken. The storm raged outside while Clara sat in her father's chair with the sleeping Murray child in her arms. Her resolve became as solid as Castle Rock above the city. She would not use what she had found merely to rescue herself. She would use it to restore what had been withheld. By morning the storm had passed, leaving Edinburgh washed clean under pale sunlight. Clara left the Murrays sleeping in the warmth of the back room and carried one bond and its corresponding letter to Samuel Bell, a senior solicitor known for quiet judgment and unbending integrity. His office was lined with law books and worn ledgers, and he listened without interrupting as Clara explained the discovery. Samuel examined the letter twice, then held the bond to the light and studied the seal and watermark. At last he set both documents on the desk. They were genuine, he told her. The bond was valid, and the letter was an admission that the funds had been held in trust. The legal consequence was not vague. It was direct and serious. Clara told him about the 17 books, the fused pages, the names, and Carstairs' hidden system. Samuel's expression changed from professional reserve to astonished respect. He advised her to leave the documents with him. He would contact the families and require Vale and Sons to answer for the trust. Clara was to return to the shop and say nothing publicly until the evidence had been secured. The effect of that meeting spread through Edinburgh like a stone dropped into still water. Lady Eleanor Vale was summoned to Samuel's office that afternoon. She sitted with her usual composure and emerged later visibly diminished, refusing to meet the eyes of people in the corridor. There was no sensational trial and no public spectacle. Samuel handled the matter with quiet precision, insisting that the honor of the city's commerce depended on restoration rather than theatre. One by one, the families named in Carstairs' hidden library were called to Samuel's chambers. They entered with guarded expressions and left stunned, some in tears. Money believed lost for years was returned. Debts could be paid. Homes could be saved. Names that had carried the stain of supposed failure began to recover their dignity. Samuel insisted on documentation for every transfer. He traced heirs where an original account holder had died, compared signatures, and required Vale and Sons to acknowledge the trust without disguising repayment as charity. Clara attended only when needed. She did not want the families to feel indebted to her personally. The money had always been theirs. Her role, she told Samuel, was simply to help the promises reach the people to whom they belonged. The whispers in the close outside Clara's shop changed as well. Mockery became curiosity. Curiosity became respect. People who had once walked past merely to stare now stopped to speak. The Murray family, their future restored, became Clara's first true customers, buying a small book of nursery rhymes for their child. The change did not happen in a single day. Some neighbors remained suspicious of good fortune that arrived so suddenly. Others wanted details Clara refused to give. But the practical evidence of renewal was impossible to ignore. Coal was delivered. A glazier came to replace cracked panes, a carpenter repaired the warped front door. The close itself seemed brighter simply because the shop no longer presented a blind wall of grime to the street. What had been a place people hurried past became a place where they slowed down. Others brought modest offerings, a warm meat pie, a sack of coal, a repaired shutter, a few coins for a volume of poetry or history. The community that had laughed at Clara's folly began, piece by piece, to rebuild the world around her. Carstairs Bookshop was no longer treated as a grave. It was becoming a landmark of hope. Autumn hardened into winter, then softened into a hesitant Scottish spring. The shop transformed with the seasons. Grime disappeared from the windows. The chaotic mountains of books became orderly, welcoming shelves. The air smelled of polished wood, old paper, and binding glue instead of damp decay. A fire crackled in the restored hearth, and warm gaslight spilled onto the cobbles at evening. Clara changed as well. Colour returned to her face, and the stillness in her eyes became calm rather than grief. Ink grew round and imperious, sleeping on ledgers as if he had always owned the place. Scholars, students, clerks, and ordinary readers began to seek out the shop. It was not merely surviving, it was thriving. Clara used only a small portion of her father's restored funds to make the building sound and comfortable. The greater part she kept in careful trust, mindful of the lesson hidden inside Carstairs' shelves. Wealth, she had learned, could preserve or destroy, depending on whether promises were honoured. She repaired the leaking roof, reinforced the rear stair, replaced cracked panes, and paid a cabinet maker to mend the worst shelving rather than replace it. She kept the old counter, the brass rails, and even the scarred floorboards where generations of boots had worn shallow paths. The shop's beauty came from survival rather than perfection. Students liked the high window table in the afternoon. Older customers favoured the chair nearest the fire. Children learned that ink tolerated respectful hands and fled from noisy ones. One evening the bell over the door chimed, and Mr. Abernethy stepped inside. He moved slowly, but his eyes were bright. He did not look first at Clara. He looked at the room, the clean floor, warm light, ordered shelves, and quiet movement of readers. A deep smile spread across his face. Clara kept the 17 books together on a special table, their secret cavities now empty. Mr. Abernethy ran an ink-stained finger along the spine of this old Scottish law volume. Carstairs, he said, had always believed the shop would wait for someone who understood what was bound inside. Clara looked from the books to the window, where neighbours passed and nodded to her with genuine warmth. She thought of her father, not bent over ledgers in ruin, but alive in memory, teaching her to respect paper and listen to what it held. In that quiet, golden moment, the full meaning of her journey settled around her. She had not purchased merely a bookshop. She had purchased a bank of promises. The phrase did not mean that the shelves had been a bank in any conventional sense. It meant that Carstairs had trusted paper to remember what frightened people and powerful institutions preferred to forget. He had preserved obligation inside bindings no banker thought important. Clara had inherited no formal title from him, yet by listening carefully she had become the person capable of completing his unfinished act. That, more than the money, felt like the true inheritance. Thank you for joining us on this journey of quiet vindication. If this story of patience, hidden truth and restored honor resonated with you, consider leaving a like, a comment, or subscribing for more tales of forgotten promises brought back into the light.